I'm going to ring the bell, but I'm going to ask you to remain seated. Thank you. I want to say welcome to Yakima Downtown Rotary. We appreciate you all being here. Especially want to thank the greeters today. I think it was Rick Gross and Sherry Green. Thank you very much. Tomorrow is Veterans Day. In 2019, a group of Rotarians led by Kurt Laberton and Russ Mazzola asked the city of Yakima for a proclamation regarding honoring the citizens on Veterans Day. On November 5th, 2019, Mayor Kathy Coffey signed the following proclamation for Veterans Day and all subsequent Veterans Days. So whereas Veterans Day is a day set aside to honor military veterans and is a national holiday observed throughout the United States of America, the city of Yakima wishes to recognize Veterans Day in a manner which will encourage its citizens to focus on the commitment and sacrifice made by its veterans. Now, therefore, I, Kathy Coffey, Mayor of the City of Yakima, and on behalf of the Yakima City Council, I do hereby proclaim that on November 11th, 2019, and on each November 11th thereafter, the citizens of Yakima, at the beginning of the 11th hour, pause in their activities and cease talking for a period of 1 minute as a means of honoring all veterans. Now, I think I started off and said, no, I did say tomorrow is Veterans Day, so that is correct. So tomorrow, when it's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th, the 11th hour, the 11th month, the 11th day, did I get that right here? Okay. Please remember to get it right and take a minute to contemplate our veterans' commitment and sacrifice. So right now, I would ask you to take out your phones and put that in your appointments for tomorrow. At 10:59, you'll get it, set it up for an alarm, and then you can take that 1 minute to contemplate our veterans and what they have done to sacrifice for our country. So, and before I introduce the music today, I'd like to also note that today is the 247th anniversary of the U.S. Marine Corps. So Marines in the group, happy anniversary. So what we're going to do now with our music is we're going to have a medley of the 5 service anthems. And if you are a veteran, and as your anthem comes up on the screen and in the music, please stand. And I'm not sure which we're going to start with, but watch the screen, listen to the music, stand at the appropriate time for the service that you served with, and then we'd like to acknowledge your service. Carolyn? And you're welcome to sing along, please. U.S. Navy, all stand please and sing out loud. Our Thank you, Navy. We have a Coast Guard. Oh, we do. We have a couple. Thank you, Coast Guard. Air Force. All right, Rick Lenaway, David Brown. Flyboys, right? Thank you, Air Force. Marines, yes. Russ Mazzola. Anybody? One Marine? Would all the veterans stand up and let us give you some applause? Yes. Oh. All right, those Marines went on and on, didn't they? But that's what they do. All right. Thank you very much. Tom Frula with our invocation.
Thank you, President Rick, and I will not go on and on. I suspect that a few of you noticed that there was an election earlier this week, and no, I am not going to get political, so Carolyn, don't panic. But I want to remind us that the freedoms we have, including the ability to have an election, is because of you veterans and the personnel who are presently in our armed service. So I think it's very appropriate and significant that both of these events are in the same week. So join me in thanking our Heavenly Father for our veterans and our freedoms. Heavenly Father, we do thank you that we live where we have the freedom and we have the military who are protecting that freedom now and have for decades. We are very privileged and we thank you and we acknowledge it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, at this time, I'd like to have all the guests who are here today, if you would please stand so that we can acknowledge your presence and see who we have with us today. And we have our speaker to thank for many of the guests, so thank you. Let's see, next. This is the second week of Native American Heritage Month, and I'm going to read the land acknowledgement that, as John did last week, and it goes like this. The practice of land acknowledgement represents a commitment to a culture of inclusion that begins with recognizing the indigenous peoples of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation. We acknowledge the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands that our community is built on today, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. As part of Native American Heritage Month, we are going to have a historical perspective presentation on Wednesday, November 16th at 5:30 at the YVC Conference Center. And if you haven't been to one of these historical perceptions, I encourage you to go. It is history, and it might not be history that you learned at school, because we didn't really go into depth in all aspects of history. We had a lot of history to learn, and there were, I think, a lot of gaps that we didn't know of or learn about. But we dig a little bit deeper in the historical perspectives, and we have a Native American scholar and attorney Tom Zielman, if I said that right, hopefully, will be discussing the history of tribal lands and the U.S. allotment policy before 1934, with a view towards the impact to the Yakima Reservation, both then and now. So you're invited to attend. This is at 5:30, the 16th of November, YVC Conference Center. You're encouraged to bring family and guests. So looks like next up I have a, whoops, did I hear my name? Oh, I thought somebody. Okay. Next up, present a blue badge to Bob Harrison. And that just means that Bob graduated from red to blue.
Right.
And that's not political.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Welcome. And one of the tasks that Bob had to perform to receive this blue badge was to staple, I don't know how many hundreds of bags or labels to bags for the Operation Harvest, so thank you. Rotary Foundation Major Donor Award. And I am hoping that Sony Alexander is here. Do I see her? Sony, please come forward. And I have to bring it all. See if there's anything else in here. No. This award is earned by a Rotarian who has donated up to $10,000 to the Rotary Foundation during the membership period. So today I am proud to present this to Sony Alexander for her support of the Rotary Foundation. It's amazing. I hope you agree. Let's open it. Shall we open it up to you? Thank you. So, Kevin Good. I've been he's coming forward for Sergeant of Arms, but I'm just going to really be cheesy here, and I'm going to say, Kevin, you better be good. And for that,
$8.
pay $5.
There we go.
All right.
Do I have a clicker up here, Carolyn? You can toss it. No? Oh. Got it. Okay. All's right. Could I get that blown up? Okay, did a little bit of a bait and switch for you guys today, because this has nothing to do with our speakers and everything to do with the auction that is happening when? Which is next Saturday. We are just a little over a week away. Seems like a mile, but we're a little over a week away from our auction. And the reason I'm talking here today is because I think there's been a pretty cool, event that's happened with respect to the Raise the Paddle. I wanted to bring you up to speed on perhaps that strategy that's being utilized, and maybe one of you could think about that as well. So, if you're still awake after reading this title, Tax Efficient Charitable Giving, I do have some questions that will maybe fine a few of you, maybe not. And then at the end of that, I'm going to walk through the strategy that this individual took advantage of, and then perhaps you can think of yourselves or others in that, all right? So, without further ado, we're going to work through some acronyms. So, what does the acronym IRA stand for? Okay, I'll walk through some acronyms. Is it an individual residual account? How many think that? No? Individual reward account? Yeah, perhaps. Individual retirement account? Or an IRATE at the moment because it's reduced in value account? Everybody's kind of in the D category, right? Well, of course, it is an IRA, okay? And we'll be talking about why I'm talking about that here in a second. So which form of IRA requires taxes to be paid on distributions? Is it a traditional IRA? Non-traditional IRA? Is that a thing? A Roth IRA? Or all of them? A traditional IRA requires taxes to be paid on those distributions, perhaps. Question 3. When blessed with reaching the age of 72 or 70 and a half, if, before 1/1/2020, what must traditional IRA holders do on an annual basis? Turn the account over to the Social Security Administration? Distribute all gains to their favorite child, perhaps? Clear the account to take their spouse to Lululemon, Nordstrom, etc.? Maybe a few of you have done that. Or take what's called a required minimum distribution and pay tax. Can you still hear me? RMD. D, yes. D. So, but what if I don't need the money? Must I still take a distribution and pay the tax? Well, perhaps not, okay? And so this is where the example of what we have so fortunately received for the Raise the Paddle portion of our auction this year comes into play. So we have a donor who will remain anonymous in an amount that will remain secret until you come to the auction. But they utilize their RMD as a charitable donation directly to Rotary Charities as a matching fund for the Raise the Paddle portion. So what does that mean? Well, in any given year, you can donate directly from your IRA to a 501c3 up to $100,000 a year and fulfill any RMD requirement you might have and not pay the tax on the distribution. Okay. To contrast that, if you perhaps would otherwise like to pay in cash, well, what do we have to do? Distribute the cash, pay the tax. That tax goes to Uncle Sam and not the charity of your choice. Are you seeing perhaps the advantage if we're in that position of utilizing the charitable distribution? So, money goes directly from an IRA to a 501c3. Please do not give us Bitcoin. Not allowed. Okay. And that's what's been utilized. So if you're looking at perhaps the end of the year here, they are due December 31st. That's when the distributions must be taken. Fun fact, they've got to be taken every year, and not every year is an auction year, but you can also do a 501c3 contribution every year. Perhaps Rotary Charities can get worked in that way. And it's not only limited to IRAs. So if any of you happen to still have stock that's appreciated in value, maybe one or two, okay, you can also think about giving us a contribution of appreciated stock. Well, what does that do for me? It avoids the capital gains rates, and I get to deduct the fair market value of whatever's given. Okay, so that's another tax-efficient way to support a charity of your choosing. Doesn't have to be Rotary, but if I hope anything comes out of this talk, that you at least have that one takeaway, that you have the ability to do this, and you can execute it. Still no Bitcoin on these as well. Okay? I think that's it. Any questions? Good? Okay, thank you.
I think there's some hands are going up. I was going to say everybody with an IRA to pay $1, but looks like you're in the process of doing that, so thank you. Well, Kevin, you were good, by the way. You were good. You were good. Our speaker today is going to be introduced by a past Yakima Rotary president, the year 2008, 2009, district governor from 2015 to 2016. Anybody guess who that might be? Besides Jan Luring? Greg Luring will introduce our speaker.
Well, our speaker today is Peggy Ludwick, and as you saw from the displays and things here in the screen, her topic obviously is going to be about her father and his service during World War II. Peggy was born and raised in Wenatchee, Washington, the other apple capital of the world. I added that part, Peg. She left in 1966 for college at Washington State University, where she graduated with a BS in microbiology and public health. In 1977, she and her former husband, Dr. Bob Henretic, moved to Yakima, where they raised their 3 children, Josh, Heather, and Ben Henretic. Peggy worked as a gender equity and STEM education specialist in the Yakima School District and in ESD 105. She did these jobs for over 25 years. In 2015, after living in Yakima for 38 years, she moved back to her hometown, Wenatchee, Washington, after a 50-year absence, completing her geographic life cycle. Her father was a young medical officer and regimental combat surgeon on the front lines in World War II. She discovered her father's 265 detailed and eloquent letters to his wife back home. Finding these old letters was a revelation and a gift Peggy felt compelled to share with the world. And what a better way to share than to write a book. So here to tell you about the amazing story of her father, please welcome to the podium, Peggy Ludwick.
Clicker. Boy, returning back to Wenatchee made me sound a little bit like a salmon returning to spawn or something like my geographic life cycle. That was good. Okay, I'm going to just start off here with a little drama. So, and I have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to be talking fast, and fasten your seatbelt. Do we dim the lights? No. Okay.
North Africa, 1943. Dearest Jean, making war on a foreign soil is a curious mixture of almost hysterical excitement and mind-dulling boredom. You can frequently hear the clear, high notes of the church bells pealing in the shadows. Its pastoral beauty is hardly appropriate as a setting for war. The cheerful bells and the sound of cannon just don't go together. I know a great many men that are now overseas will be strangers when they return. I'm going to need you very much when I get home. Love, Lud. A Doctor's War. Letters and reflections from the front lines of World War II.
Well, I still kind of tear up hearing my son speak my father's words. And it's nice having a documentary filmmaker in the family. Thank you, Ben Henretic. And thank you to Downtown Yakima Rotary for inviting me to share some of my dad's experiences as a medical officer and a combat surgeon on the front lines of World War II. It's so nice to see some familiar faces in the audience and my little cheerleading table here. I wasn't sure how many people would be here, so I invited a few of my own. My dad was a loyal and dedicated member of Rotary in Wenatchee for decades. In fact, it has been said that at one point he had 30 years perfect attendance. I don't know how that's possible. But anyway, he believes strongly in Rotary and its mission. All right, so let me see here. Does this work? Oh, okay. In 1945, after the war, my parents were in Iowa. They decided to head west, looking for a place to call home. They were modern pioneers, essentially. And they went through Spokane and then continued on to Waterville. And as they wound down the road from Waterville, they were met by the mighty Columbia River. And my dad, in his innate wisdom, decided that this vast natural resource would provide an economic stability in the area. So they settled in Wenatchee, the apple capital of the world. Okay, I still have to do this. Okay. My parents lived in Wenatchee for 68 years. My dad practiced family medicine for 52 of those years. He treated generations of families, and he delivered almost 2,000 babies. He had a dry sense of humor, a quick wit, and deadpan delivery. And here's an example. He went back to his University of Kansas Medical School reunion one year when he was the speaker, and he took with him a big box of Wenatchee apples. And when it was his turn to speak, he lugged this box of apples up to the podium, handing out samples along the way. And he said, you know, it's been really tough making a living as a doctor in Wenatchee, Washington, the apple capital of the world. Do you get it? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. My dad was a quiet and modest man. Not many people, even his Rotarian colleagues, did not know that of his heroism during World War II. He earned the Purple Heart in Tunisia, which it's a harrowing story in the book that you can read about, and earned the Silver Star for gallantry in action in Italy. Those are two unusual combat commendations for an unarmed medical officer. So let's go back to the beginning of my dad's military service and his perspective of the war through a medical officer's eyes. In 1940, he was in Waterloo, a brand new physician, not earning very much money, and his friends said, hey, Doc, we're all gonna go join the Iowa National Guard. Why don't you come with us? You'll be guaranteed a captain's rank at the end of 1 year of service and a $1,000 bonus check. Well, that sounded good to my dad, so he went down to Camp Claiborne in Louisiana for the Louisiana maneuvers of the 34th Infantry Division, which was primarily all National Guard units from Iowa, North Dakota, and Minnesota. He and my mom courted in Waterloo, where my mom was working at the small Presbyterian hospital there, and finally he convinced her to marry him in October 1941. So on December 7th, 1941, that day of infamy, my parents were playing golf with 3 other officers and their wives in Oakdale, and that was the day Pearl Harbor was bombed and everything changed. My dad found himself on the first U.S. troop ship to Europe after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, destination unknown. They boarded an old retrofitted British passenger ship that did horribly in the North Atlantic in some terrible storms, but they didn't swamp or sink, luckily. And no one knew where they were headed. And they didn't find out until they were almost there. They were going to Northern Ireland. And why would the first U.S. troop ship go to Northern Ireland? Well, it was a friendly nation, a neutral country, somewhat obscure, and in a potentially, no army of its own, and a potentially strategic location, poised for, to move anywhere quickly if they needed to. So they landed in Belfast and then made their way to the very northern shore of Northern Ireland, a little community called Castle Rock. It was a resort community, 200 people, and all of a sudden 1,000 troops descended on this town with all their vehicles and their tanks and their, everything. It was quite a shock to the villagers. Oh, let me go back. See the photo in 1942? This is a current photo of Castle Rock. Some things don't change that much. So my dad's medical assistant was a physician, Lieutenant Morris J. Leslie. He was everything my dad was not. He was short, he was Jewish, he was from Brooklyn, he was a physician. He had thick black hair, he was a cut-up, he was a party organizer, and wouldn't you know, he and my dad became the best of friends throughout the whole war, and they complemented each other very well, but looked like Mutt and Jeff in the medical aid station. So, there is this existential cord that binds soldiers together who have fought together under adverse conditions, and Leslie, unfortunately, died at a young age, 56, and in part due to PTSD, and you can read about that in my chapter called Walking Wounded. In 1956, I was 7. We went back east, my family, from Wenatchee on the Great Northern Railroad to visit relatives in the Midwest, and then on to New York City, where we spent time with this family. I had no idea who they were, but they were, in fact, Morris J. Leslie's family, and you can see the affection there on the right of Les and my dad. So back to Northern Ireland, they were in training there, and really a lot of the soldiers thought it was kind of a bit of a lark, but they needed to build camaraderie and morale, and censorship was a big deal. My dad was his unit censor, and had to cut out any reference to where they were. This is why it took me so long to research my dad's route throughout the war. But they loved to give dances and parties, and they would invite the Red Cross nurses and the village girls. And you can see on this poster, it says, owing to unavoidable circumstances, this dance had to be canceled, but it was due really to my dad contracting German measles, and they had to quarantine the whole regiment. My dad was treating village people as well. So he wasn't very popular that weekend. So my dad was always amazed at the Yankee ingenuity. Many countries have conscripted armies where they must follow orders to the exact T. They don't have any latitude to come up with solutions of their own. So the British troops had been pumping manually water from the well in this little village that took hours, and the Americans saw that and said, hey, we can hook up the front wheel drive of our Jeep, lift it up, and in minutes they pumped water that took the British hours. So finally, after 10 months, oh, I have a little thing here. Oh, well. I have a little pointer. Oh, you can see it. After 10 months, the 34th Infantry boarded ships in Liverpool, UK, and traveled down to, again, destination unknown, but they soon learned they were going to be going to North Africa. And actually, along the way, one of their own ships rammed them, and they almost sunk, and the Americans were still really kind of figuring out all this war business. I don't know if some of you know, or have read Rick Atkinson. Oh, let me just go back. The goal was to move across North Africa to the east, take Tunisia, which then would be the launching point to get into Sicily and southern Italy. So here they made their way out. They had many, many battles, horrible battles in Tunisia, but did eventually make it to Tunis. Here's a picture of they didn't have selfies back then, so, and my dad doesn't have that many pictures of him during the war, but Leslie took this picture of him in Africa. So the first two battles with General Rommel's African Corps, highly trained German troops, were disasters for the Americans. Many, many casualties. 1,000 soldiers were taken prisoner of war. And these young, inexperienced soldiers who had been training in Northern Ireland were inexperienced. They were poorly trained. They were lacking in all the latest weaponry and communications equipment because they were sent so quickly from the U.S. to Northern Ireland, because FDR wanted to show a strong and immediate presence in Europe after Pearl Harbor, that they had all World War I issued equipment. So this is the German 88, which was a much feared, high velocity, large bore cannon with great superiority to anything in the American arsenal. As a result, there were a high number of casualties, 1,000 POWs in these first two skirmishes, and lots of PTSD. There's an interesting story about this. It looks bad on a commanding officers to have a lot of casualties, and it looks bad on their record. And psychological casualties are just counted in with the physical casualties. So my dad's commanding officer said, "Doc, we can't evacuate these guys. I don't want to evacuate them. See what you can do with them." So my dad's innovative treatment of this, the story is called The Magic of Oatmeal, and you'll have to read it in the book. Coincidentally, my dad, Lud's father, was a physician also and a psychiatrist in World War I who treated shell shock aviators, our nation's first daring young pilots. And my grandfather was one of the first nation's trained flight surgeons, and he used a technique to treat these shell shock aviators that was psychodrama, and my dad took a psychological approach to treating these PTSD casualties in his units. And he must have learned from his dad. So unfortunately, there were a lot of casualties, innocent casualties of war, but here is, this is in North Africa. His medical assistants were often dentists, and here's a dentist treating an Arab. But there were many, many children who found their way to my dad's medical aid station and were treated with, horrible injuries, and also just sickness and needs for medical attention. So this is a favorite photo of my dad. This reminds me of him, his kind of very pensive, contemplative mode. But you'll notice the typewriter. That's supposedly a portable typewriter. It's a huge thing. And his medical trunk. But he lugged that typewriter with him everywhere, typing out these phenomenal, eloquent letters. And because of that typewriter, I have the remnants of his letters. So here's a typical medical jeep evacuating 3 soldiers on 3 litters. They could handle about 3 of wounded at a time. Lots of, traffic and movement and evacuation. So I don't know if some of you have read any of Rick Atkinson's books. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning best-selling author. He wrote the Liberation Trilogy about North Africa, Italy, and D-Day. And he's on now writing another trilogy about the Revolutionary War. But a year ago I thought, what the heck? I'm going to write this guy a letter and see if he would read my manuscript and maybe give me an endorsement. So, long story short, he did read the manuscript and gave me a very nice endorsement. And the lesson from that is, if you don't ask, you don't get. So finally, towards the end of the North African campaign, my dad earned the Purple Heart, which was a pretty dramatic story in the fields when he had to throw his body over a wounded soldier he was treating. You can read about that also. But after May 1943 is when the North African campaign ended, and the 34th Division took a couple of months to repair and rest and retrain. And then finally, in December of 1943, they sailed from Iran to Salerno, Italy. Oh, this is where I need my thing. Hold on. Oh, it's not there. Hold on. Yeah, okay. Do you see where Salerno is? No? All right. Well, there. Oh, there. See it? Okay, this is actually a cat toy, so I don't think it... There. I do what I can. I'm my own agent, okay, so... and this is what they were fighting in. This is why it took so long to make any headway in Italy. They were fighting in the mountains, in the Apennine mountain range. And here's a little excerpt from one of my dad's letters. I mean, there are many eloquent excerpts in the book. And because of the mud and the rain and the ice and the sleet and the snow, and then the Germans would purposely flood the banks of rivers so that the Americans' vehicles could not navigate at all. But it took them so long to get anywhere. In fact, sickness and disease counted for at least 50% of the casualties during the war. Both sides suffered terrible, terrible casualties. The Battle of Cassino was actually a bloodbath, very not well coordinated and not well thought through by General Mark Clark. And there's still history being written about the effect that General Mark Clark had on the war. Here's my dad earning the Silver Star for gallantry in action on Mount Pantano, which is kind of like Saddle Rock in Wenatchee. That's a harrowing. You can read actually the official commendation back on the table to realize what he went through. Okay, let's see here. And after the approach and Battle of Cassino took several months during the winter of 1944, and the 168th, after being on the front lines for 2 or 3 weeks, would retreat back to this little Italian village called San Angelo d'Alife. And they bunked up with the villagers, and my dad and his officers stayed with 2 little old ladies who were sisters, and they loved the Americans. And I think I asked him one time how old they were, and he said, oh, I think they were like 64. Little old ladies, gosh, you know, that's... Please. So plasma was the go-to in the war. Unlike fresh blood that has to be refrigerated and expires after 2 to 3 weeks, plasma came, it was a game changer. It came in powdered form, could be reconstituted on the battlefield with sterile water, and it had an immediate counter effect to shock until the wounded could be taken back to the aid station or further back to the evacuation hospital. One very personal part of this story is my mother's beloved younger brother, Jack Hoyer, who was also in the war, and my dad was able to meet up with him several times in North Africa and Italy, was tragically killed in Italy 2 weeks after my dad had spent the day with him. And This is Jack with his little adopted dog. So my dad typed everything from the age of 12. He left a very rich paper trail of his life. Here he is, for his retirement, his office staff gave him this little cartoon book that was just very well done. But here are his medical school lecture notes, that he typed. And he made a carbon copy of every letter he ever sent and filed and kept every letter he ever received. So, as I said, I have a huge archive of who he was, and he documented the details of his life. So these are the letters that were under my parents' bed on the left, in cotton twine, string. My mom hadn't reread them after my dad got home. They were still just as she received them. And then this is the box now after I went through all these letters and read them. They are in order. Doesn't look like it, but they are. This book is both a war story and a love story. And I think women would enjoy this book as much as men, because my dad's letters were long and detailed, filled with yearning and love and hope. My parents had only been married 2 months, and then he was gone for 2.5 years. So he was really trying to keep the flame of that young love going. He philosophized about life, leadership, human character, the irrational nature of war, and keen observations about the people and cultures and landscapes that were all around him. But for me, in these letters, I met a clever, passionate, courageous young man that I didn't know growing up before he was my father. This was the young man that I met in these letters. So once I started reading these letters, so here's one of his letters. And there's actually a 5-page letter back there. I don't think it has any errors in it. Use this rapid fire hunt and peck technique, like this. It was just amazing. So I once I started reading the letters and realizing what was there, I decided to excerpt portions that I thought would be interesting to people just outside my family. And I did have the sense to keep a catalog of these letters for reference. So these are some of his artifacts, some of which are back there, but I didn't lug everything here. His field surgical tools. It was, he referred to Northern Ireland as Swamp Island. He said it was the most miserable, wet, damp place he'd ever been in. And of course, he labeled everything. He not only wrote down everything and documented, he labeled everything, so his name's on everything. We know those were his. And this is my dad's life motto that I heard my entire life. Success is doing something you don't want to do and doing it well. Because everything from there is, downhill. It's easy. And it certainly served my dad well during World War II. So here are the kind of so whats of this book for me, and I'm asking maybe they will be for you. My father's letters still remain alive and are remarkably relevant. They provide timeless insights into the nature of love and war, 2 of human history's most enduring themes. Their soft yet steady pulse still throbs with quiet wisdom and remarkable relevance. Here are a few other things in the book that I just didn't have time for. My mom getting her pilot's license while my dad was overseas. My dad's dinner with Mrs. Ernest Hemingway. Martha Gellhorn is a riot because his unit gave her the hardest time. They thought she had so much affect, but she was covering the war, And, to close with, we're not only products of our ancestors' DNA, we're also product of their life choices. their life circumstances, what was happening in the greater world around them. And our stories connect us. And I'm asking, what are your stories? And what are you leaving behind for future generations to get a glimpse of who you were? Is that it? Wait a minute. Yes, that's it. Wait. One more. There's my mom and dad. Is there time for any questions? Yes? Oh, any questions? Craig? Oh, yeah, heavily censored. So he alluded to some things, and I figured out his code language, some of his coded words where it was a really rough time, a really tough time, which meant there were huge casualties, but he could never really say where he was. And that took me years to research on online military documents, books, diaries of other soldiers in the same area. So there is a chronology that I put together at the end of the book after the letters, that if you want to know where he was on December 11th, 1942, you can flip back and see where he was and what was really going on. They were primarily love letters, but they also contained a lot of details of living on the front lines. Oh. You know, I interviewed my dad for a few years before he died in 2008, just about his life. And that included his war stories, which he always shared. I was somehow more interested in them than my brother. And then after my mom died, and then I moved to Wenatchee, and you get busy with life. I would dabble at it. Sometimes I wouldn't continue to read through the letters for 6 months at a time because they were long. So finally in 2000, I finally started reading the letters in 2013 after my mom died. Realizing what I had, I then went back and started excerpting. Those took several years. That took several years. And then I had interviewed him and made a transcription of the interview. So I kind of thought, well, God, maybe there's something here with the interviews and the letters. And then I did my own research because I wanted the reader to have context of what was happening during the war in lay language that they could understand. And in 2019, my problem was I had too much material. I just had to, it would be an 800-page book if I hadn't done a lot of editing. So I hired an editor in 2019, and we worked together for 6 months. And then COVID came, which I loved because I worked, every day. And then the whole process of finding a publisher. So this is not self-published. It's an academic press for nonfiction. They have lots of genres. I don't know if some of you know Margaret France. She has the same publisher as mine, and her genre is pop culture. She wrote a book about Bob's Burgers. I don't know if you know what that is. Anyway. So the publishing part of this whole project was the most challenging. Finding a publisher, querying a publisher, trying to get an agent, which I didn't get, and then working with a publisher and all the edits and all the... Ed Stover, I got it. Ed, stand up, please. You gotta stand up. Ed Stover was my go-to editor for the last 3 years, probably 2 years. He is a retired journalist and a poet and a published writer himself. So he just spent hours proofing for me, making suggestions. And then there was also a retired history professor in Wenatchee who kind of took me on and advised me. But, it's been a long time, and kind of I need to move on probably. But I do have another project, though, that's related, so. It was a revelation to me that my father was writing these words, because this was not the man I knew, as my father. So I came by emotional. I wasn't crying or sobbing, but I was sad that I hadn't given my dad more of my time and just got to know him more as a person and not just my father. So but it was a mixture, and it was, you know, humbling that I thought I knew my dad and who he was, but I really didn't. And so this was a gift for me. I think,
Did you want to finish that thought?
thank you. Oops, my dad would be so thrilled, you know, about this. And there are, I hate to say, shameless self-promotion, there are books for sale, I believe, outside, Inklings. I hope they're there. Okay, thank you.
Hey, thank you very, very much, Peggy. That was wonderful. And I think one of your last comments about wishing you'd gotten to know your father as a person, that resonated with me, and I think many others, their parents, that think, yeah, you kind of knew them as a parent, but did you ever really know them as an individual and a person? So what a wonderful project that you were on and made available for us to follow along with you on that. All right, next, I want to say congratulations, Sony Alexander. Would you stand again? Because her contribution to the Rotary Foundation is amazing, and I just appreciate your support for that, for our club and internationally, and it's pretty special. Thank you. Today, at 3 p.m., Sonia Rodriguez-True is going to be, what's the term? I was going to say swearing in, Rebecca, investiture. Today at on the third floor of the county courthouse at 3 p.m. in courtroom 2. You're invited to attend and support her in her next step within the court system. So pretty special. Next week, we have Jeffrey Calloway training the next generation of fermentation scientists. So to prepare for this meeting, you need to try a lot of different beer, I think. So that'll be here at the Convention Center. My golly, is the next Thursday after that Thanksgiving? I can't believe that. And then Laura Crook's Children's Village right after Thanksgiving. The next Thursday we'll be here at the Yakima Convention Center. It'd be great to hear about Children's Village and the path that it's taking going forward. So, my golly, I think that's it. What's happening on the 19th of this month? No, I didn't hear it. Okay, yes, the Rotary auction. Hope to see all or most of you there. We're adjourned.